Make no mistake about that. Solid left hook scored by Shimano. He'll hammer that body all night long if he gets the opportunity. 10 seconds left in the round. Whether you can hear me over that crowd, we got action right from the start.
We are in part number 3 of this series, Fighting Fair. Last week we gave out these cards on your way out. It's kind of a summary of the first 2 weeks of the teachings on Fighting Fair. And I said if you prefer a business-sized card, we made a bunch of them, and they're at the information center, and a bunch of you went there and they were gone already. So if you were one who went last week to get more of these, it's the same content, just in a smaller packaging, so you could put it in your wallet or in your car. If you want any of those, we had 1,000 more made in there at the information center, if you would like those. Fighting Fair is a series that we are working on. This is week number 3, and it's all about conflict and relationships and how to handle conflict in those relationships and to do it in a way that most pleases God. And so those of you who maybe are new this week, let me just take about a minute to summarize the first 2 weeks. It's in your program. There's some notes there. You may want to follow along, write some of these notes down. But week number 1 was this: your goal in conflict cannot be to win the conflict or avoid the conflict. Your goal must be to please God. You cannot be one who would rather avoid the conflict than deal with the conflict. You can't be one who wants to win the conflict rather than preserve the relationship. Your goal must be to please God. And what we talked about 2 weeks ago is just that recognition that sinful people tend to respond sinfully when sinned against. If we could recognize that in ourselves, it puts us way steps further down the road in reconciling relationships with people that we love. Last week, then, the second principle, we talked about this: you must focus on your part of the conflict regardless of what the other person does. You must focus on your part of the conflict. Again, our tendency is, I'm going to do this, but they better. And if they don't do what they should do, then we think we have the right not to do what God calls us to do. And that's why James says that the biggest enemy in our conflict is us. Your biggest enemy in conflict is you. My biggest enemy in conflict is me. Why? Because what causes fights and quarrels among you, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You have these good desires that become bad desires, and you want to do the right thing, but there's something in you that wants something else more than doing the right thing, or wants something more than honoring and pleasing God. So we've spent the first 2 weeks really focused on this idea that before you look at the other person and how they need to change and how they need to grow and what they need to do in relational conflict, you need to look in the mirror at yourself, at your own tendency towards sinful choices, at your own tendency to react sinfully when things don't go your way, at your own tendency to sin when sinned against. And we've really focused on you, and we've focused on the problem. Today we're going to turn toward the solution. Today we're going to talk about still you. We're not going to focus on the other person yet. That's going to come next week. But here's how I want to focus on you today: what to do when you blow it. If you know that there's a relationship that's in conflict and you've done something wrong, that you've participated in fracturing that relationship. Maybe you did something wrong, you said something wrong, or you reacted in a wrong, unhelpful way. What should you do when you blow it? That's what we're going to focus on today. We have this terrible tendency, though. We want to focus very quickly on the other person. Yeah, I want to do us right, but what about them? And we have a tendency to want to fix our spouse. We have a tendency I just wish my child would make the right choices. And so we confront our child about making the right choices. And in the process of confronting them about sinful choices, we sin against them in how we confront them. And so we're going to focus on us. What do we need to do when we know we've done anything wrong? I don't care if 90% of the problem is theirs. We're going to focus today on our 10%. Because if we can know what to do when we blow it, if we can know what to do when we sin, then we'll be further down the road towards reconciling relationships. Because you can't control what they'll do. You can only, by God's grace, control the choices that you make. And we're so much better in conflict at looking through windows at other people's problems and sins than we are at looking in the mirror of our own sinfulness and our own problems. Our tendency is to blame shift. We're very good at justifying our sinful choices. We're very good at rationalizing our sinful reactions. And we are after much more than behavior modification. We are after heart transformation. This is not a series just giving you some good tips in how to handle conflict. This is about how to change, how to have our hearts rearranged to want to please God. And when we want to please God, we end up looking and acting more like Jesus. So we're going to talk about certainly some specifics of what to do in conflict. But ultimately, it's about transforming our hearts. So today, what to do when you blow it. And a lot of this comes down to communication, communicating well, communicating rightly. If we're sinning against each other and we don't communicate about that in a healthy, helpful way, it's just going to get worse. Years ago, there was a commercial. I still think it's probably one of my favorite commercials of all time that really is about communicating and how important communicating is. So let me show that to you. Take a look.
Das hier ist mein Sektor.
Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät.
Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
That's awesome, right? If you're not talking the same language or you're not communicating well, then it's not going to get better. And two sinners that are living in the same household, that are struggling with sinful reactions and behaviors and thoughts, being committed to fixing that is good, and learning to communicate in biblical, right, God-honoring ways is crucial. If there's poor communication, sin is going to be compounded. We're going to see more and more broken relationships. And that's not what we want. Now, the reality is, we have this tendency to think, well, my default reactions to conflict, whether it's escape or attack responses, that's just what I've done my whole life. I can't do it differently. Well, actually, you can. Number one, you can if you're a follower of Christ because God's Spirit lives in you. But beyond that, even all of us, no matter if we're followers of Christ or not, we can choose our responses to conflict because you respond differently when your husband does something against you than you would if it was your boss at work. You respond differently if it's someone in your house that drives you crazy compared to a person that you're trying to build a friendship with and that you kind of want to impress. But we just tend to excuse ourselves with those that we live in a household with. We tend to excuse ourselves with those we actually love the most, we actually can hurt the most deeply. And so this is about helping you improve your relationship with your family, but also your friends and your coworkers and your neighbors and your in-laws, your classmates. So what to do when you blow it? We have this tendency that we want to fix other people. Well, when you have a relationship that's broken, how do you fix it? Do you seek forgiveness? Do you confess it to other people? Confession and forgiveness is one of the most poorly practiced habits in our country, if practiced at all. And it's not just poorly practiced among people in our nation, it's poorly practiced by followers of Jesus, because our focus, this is just because we're sinners, is to look at the other person and what they're doing wrong, what they've done wrong, what they're doing wrong now. So we're going to spend one more week before we talk about the two people trying to get on the same page. We're going to talk about you. And again, the reason I do that is you can't control them. By God's grace, you can only make choices for yourself. And it comes down to Romans 12:18, where Paul says this statement, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. If it is possible, it's not always possible, but if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, you can't make choices for them, you can only make choices for you. Live at peace with everyone. Paul Tripp made this statement that I love and refer to often. Conflict with others is one of God's mysterious, counterintuitive ways of rescuing us from ourselves. I got an email this week from a friend who said, hey, last week you prayed that God would provide us enough conflict in our lives to show us areas of growth. And then they ended the email by saying, could you please stop praying that prayer for us? But it's true. Conflict is not simply about, man, I want this relationship to go better. Conflict is one of God's mysterious, counterintuitive ways of rescuing us from ourselves, of showing us where we're sinners and where we fall short and where we need God's incredible grace for us, and then be able to display that grace with others. So, when you are in conflict, how do you handle it? What do you do? How is it resolved? What choices do you make? How do you make it right? Do you apologize? How do you apologize? The reality is most apologies in our culture are pseudo-apologies. They're fake apologies. Years ago, the Democrat and Chronicle, the local paper here in Rochester, wrote a whole series of articles And the articles were, I think, or maybe it was just one article, but it was a lengthy article about the phony ways that we apologize. I think they called it sorry excuses for apologies. That's what it was. Sorry excuses for apologies. This week in Time Magazine, there was an article. It's the Time Magazine dated tomorrow, March 10th, 2014, and they talk about faux apologies. I love that word. Faux apologies, fake apologies. And it lists a bunch of people who in the last few months have had to make apologies. And when they go public with their apology, you listen to it, they use the word apology, but did they really apologize at all? People like Paula Deen and Alec Baldwin and Shia LaBeouf, Chris Christie, these guys that have had to make apologies, but when you listen, what kind of apology is it really? So let me introduce you to 5 very common faux apologies, fake apologies, and I think you will find that most apologies, this is not just public figures that use this kind of apology, these are apologies that are used by you and they're used by me. Let me listen for you. Number 1, common faux apology is the if apology. This is an apology that attaches the word if to it before or in the middle and basically cancels out the apology. They'll say things like, I am really sorry if that hurt you. If that offended anyone, I'm sorry. If you misunderstood what I was saying, I'm sorry. The word if just cancels out an apology. You feel better because you're saying you're sorry, but it doesn't really make anybody feel better for long who's really paying attention. An if apology basically takes the blame away from you and onto someone or something else. A second common faux apology is the passive apology. A passive apology is when people say they're sorry if, or not if, sorry, I'm sorry mistakes were made. I'm sorry we see this differently. I'm sorry I probably could have done that better. I'm sorry I was really tired. I'm sorry I wasn't feeling well. I'm sorry it's been a long day. I'm sorry the kids were driving me crazy today. In other words, it's an apology, but it's not quite my fault. It's a passive apology. Number 3, beyond the passive apology, is the I didn't mean it apology. It's the statement that would say, some were unintentionally hurt by what I said. They were unintentionally hurt, so I apologize. It's I didn't really mean how you took it. In other words, it's kind of your fault because you misinterpreted what I said. The 4th common faux apology is the you're too sensitive apology. This is a classic. This is the one that, I'm sorry that hurt you. Others thought it was funny, but it hurt you, so I'm sorry. I didn't think it was a big deal, but you obviously did, so I'm sorry. See, a faux apology, to define a faux apology, it's where someone expresses contrition, but they never accept blame. They express contrition, but they refuse to accept full blame and full responsibility. A 5th common faux apology would be the I have a dark side apology. This is the person who says something like incredibly racist and then apologizes for it, but always says, but I'm not a racist. No, you are. You just proved it by what you said, right? So there's this dark side of me, but that's not who I really am. That's the alcohol talking. That's the drugs talking. That's the prescription meds that I'm addicted to talking. I'm getting help for this. I'm getting counseling for this. That's kind of how they handle that kind of thing. I have this dark side, but that dark side isn't really who I am. And there's all kinds of these examples in public figures. It is all over the place. Probably my favorite recent one is the mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford. Oh, you're familiar? Yeah, he's quite something. And I ran across a video a few weeks ago of an apology of his. And this is to the extreme, but you want to see a faux apology? Here's one. Check this out.
I withdraw the comments that I made last night, and I can't remember exactly what it was said, but I believe after Councillor Vaughan and Councillor Mammoliti, and I think you made a wrong ruling, by the way, Madam Speaker, but that's my personal opinion. I said I withdraw the comments that I made to say if there were any corrupt councillors, should say if that's the word. I'm not quite sure what I said, but that's something like that. So I withdraw that.
I'm sorry. So
So what else? I don't understand.
Okay, just a sec. What the word is that you need to say, I apologize.
How about I am so sorry? Is that as good as I apologize or so sorry? Which one do you want, Madam Speaker? Like super sorry?
Mayor Ford, please.
So sorry?
I just don't understand why he's not well loved. I just don't understand it. Probably my favorite faux-apology is Jesse Jackson from a few years ago. Jesse Jackson was on a talk show, a television talk show, like a panel type show. During a commercial, he leaned over and whispered something into the person sitting next to him, whispered into his ear. Well, the reality is, yeah, it was on commercial, but your mic is still on and they're still recording. And so the television channel he was on took it and just began playing it. It was all over the news for days. And basically, it was a very crude, rude, angry, mean comment against who at that time was candidate Barack Obama, and basically saying he wished he could castrate him because he didn't stand up to someone or something about some political issue. He said it in a crude, mean, angry way. Well, it was the news item for days, and finally he came out with a public apology. The apology was 7 minutes long, and I watched the whole thing. I didn't want to put you through 7 minutes of pain, so I want to show you, I'm going to read to you the only part of this 7-minute apology that was even close to an apology. So here's a classic faux apology. Here's what he said. If in this thing I have said into a microphone that I believed was turned off, a statement that is attributed as distraction, I apologize for that. I don't want hurt to come to this campaign. And he called this his 7-minute apology. He said, I gave an apology for 7 minutes. This is the closest he came to an apology. And of course, it starts with the key word, if. If in this thing. In other words, did I or didn't I? I'm not really sure. No, you did it. If in this thing I've said, and then here's the passive apology, into a microphone I believed was turned off. In other words, if you didn't hear it, then it's okay that I said it if it's not public. So it's the person's problem who recorded it or played it or it didn't turn off the microphone. If I said a statement that's attributed as a distraction, really? It was the only thing on the news for days. If that's a distraction, is that what you really mean? Then I apologize for that. So let's be careful. Let's be clear. What did Jesse Jackson apologize? Did he apologize for the mean, crude thing he said to President Barack Obama? No. He apologized if that statement that was recorded and shouldn't have been recorded, if that happened to be a distraction, then I apologize for the distraction. What is that? That's a faux apology. It's indicating regret, but it's not owning blame. And sadly, this doesn't just happen with politicians. People say this all the time. I'm tired, I misspoke, I wasn't clear, perhaps you misunderstood, and all it means is it's not all of my fault. Or more clearly, it's not my fault at all. And it's so common, not just with politicians, not with just cultural entertainers. It's in marriages, it's in families, and you can probably imagine the discussion. A discussion between a husband and wife where a husband says something like, there's an argument the night before, and the next day it's kind of cold in the house before they leave for work, and finally he says to her, I'm really sorry if I upset you when I yelled at you. Let's just break down that statement. Although it's common, and we tend to shrug our shoulders and accept that, let's think about that statement. I'm sorry if I upset you when I yelled at you. And then she responds, it gets even worse when she says, oh, don't worry about it, I was just tired. And they kiss and off they go to work. Wait a minute, what just happened there? I'll tell you what didn't happen. Confession didn't happen. Forgiveness wasn't requested, and it wasn't granted. All of it was just shoved aside. Basically, he blamed her. And if this wasn't so common, it would be comical. He blamed her. If you were upset because I yelled at you, number one, you knew she was upset. Number two, what do you mean, if? And she ends up not only hearing the blame, she accepts the blame and excuses her own sin by saying, well, I was just tired. And there's no discussion of sin. There's no discussion of forgiveness. There's no discussion of what I did wrong. It's all, I'm sorry if you were upset when I yelled at you. Don't worry about it. I was just tired. Come on. You hear this kind of comment constantly. I'm sorry you took my comments the wrong way. I'm sorry I yelled at you. If you would have given me a little bit of space, then I wouldn't have said that. Again, that's not my fault. That's your fault. And biblically, sin must be acknowledged and sin must be confessed. And once it's acknowledged, once it's confessed, then it can be forgiven. So if you're going to own your side of the conflict, and we're going to talk a lot about it this series, that you cannot make someone else own their part of the conflict, but you need to own 100% of your part of the conflict. If you're going to do that, there's just two things that I want to make sure you're very aware of before we talk about how to confess. And the first one is this. Dealing with your part of the conflict only is hard, very hard. Let's just be really clear on that. Dealing with your side of the conflict only is hard, very hard. Giving faux apologies is easy. That's very easy. But if you're going to view only your side of the conflict and you're going to confess it, whether or not they confess their side of the conflict, just know this is going to test you and it's going to test your character beyond what you can imagine. Because we tend to go someone to confess our apology, confess our sin, assuming that once we do, then they'll confess theirs. But they might not. So know this, if you're going to deal only with your side of the conflict, it's going to be hard, very hard, because they might not respond the way you want them to. But that's what you have to do. Jesus said this in Matthew 7, 3-5. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Jesus says you got to focus on you regardless of whether they respond well or not. The focus has got to be on you, and that's hard because we want to deal with our problem as long as they're going to deal with theirs. And biblically, reconciling relationships has to begin with I'm going to deal with my part of the conflict, whether they deal with theirs or not. The second thing you got to know about dealing with your side of the conflict is this. Dealing with your part of the conflict requires great humility, incredible humility, because they may not be willing to deal with their part of the conflict. See, rarely ever, I said this last week or the week before, that rarely ever when two people are in an argument is it only one person's fault. Rarely is that true. But our tendency is we tend to believe most of it is the other person's fault. So we think, well, I'll deal with my part of the conflict, and then they'll deal with theirs. But they may not do that, which means if you're really going to deal with your part of the conflict, you have to deal with it regardless of whether they deal with their side or not. And that's incredibly hard work, and it takes incredible humility. Because it doesn't matter whether they deal with their part of the conflict or not. God calls you to deal with your part of the sinful conflict. That's why I love Proverbs 28:13 that says this. Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. It takes incredible humility and incredible hard work to go to a person and confess your sins, how you've sinned against them. But when you do, you almost always find mercy. With God, you always do. And even with those you've offended, if you do this well, you find mercy. So here's what I want to talk about today. My main application today is the 7 A's of confession. I want to teach you how to talk to someone when you're in the wrong. And if they're in the wrong, we'll talk about that next week. But your part of it, what do you do? Because saying I'm sorry just isn't enough. If your goal is to make peace with all people, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. If your goal is to take the plank out of your eye, if your goal is to please God in your relationships, then I want to urge you to learn and practice these 7 A's of confession. Now, these 7 A's are, I use these I've done a lot of weddings in my life, and I've used these 7 A's. I've taught this with every couple that I've ever done premarital counseling with. The reason isn't because those couples are struggling with friction in their relationship then when they're engaged. The issue is because they will one day. And every couple that I've ever counseled, I've gone through these 7 A's of confession. And so I just urge you to think about this, that as I talk about this for the next about 15 minutes or so, that you would not imagine me standing in front of all of you talking about this, but that we're sitting in my office and I'm helping you think through the relationship with which you have the most conflict. Because the next 7 points I'm going to give you would be the same 7 points I give to every couple I do premarital counseling with, every couple that I do marital counseling with, every couple that I've ever talked to about a difficult relationship that they have. 7 A's of confession. And if any time you've thought, man, something went wrong in that relationship and it's still not quite right, well, this will probably help you know why it didn't go right and how it can go better. 7 A's of confession. Here they are. Number 1, address everyone involved. If you're going to do what's right when you're in friction, you have to address everyone that is involved. In other words, it always starts with God. When you've sinned, ultimately you've sinned against God. So it begins with confession to God. And all of these will apply to God and to other people. But always start with God. Once you've confessed your sin to God, address everyone who's involved. So if it's you and your spouse, there's an argument, I talked before, there's an argument the night before between you and your spouse, and the next morning, you need to talk to them about it. It's not enough just to confess it to God and say, I've confessed it to God, so I don't need to confess it to my spouse. Yes, you do. You need to seek their forgiveness. But not just the person that your anger, let's say it's angry words, your anger was geared towards. If your children heard this, they need to be addressed too. So if you sin against your spouse and your children are in the room listening to you mishandle your relationship with your spouse, you need to address them too. Address everyone involved, and I would say this, only address those involved. I've had people come and confess their bad attitude about me before. That feels really weird because I didn't know they had a bad attitude about me. And then I kind of just feel worse about why. What did I do? I don't know. Don't tell me that. Just, that's between you and God. I'm good with that. But I've also had people that have sinned against me in a public way and then came to me privately and said, hey, what I said in that meeting, that was wrong. Will you forgive me? Of course I'll forgive them, but the reality is there's a whole group of people that heard that too that don't know reconciliation has been made. Private sin needs private confession. Public sin needs public confession. Address everyone involved. Number 2, beyond address everyone involved, avoid if, but, and maybe. This is one of the crucial ones. This is what people tend not to do well. They don't do well at avoiding if, but, and maybe. If you use the word if you use the word but, if you use the word maybe, you're ultimately saying, I'm not sure I really did the wrong thing here. Or if circumstances were different, I wouldn't have done the wrong thing. Or really what we're saying is, the reason I did the wrong thing is because of these extenuating circumstances. Either what you did to me or an outside circumstance that we couldn't control. But what it is not is that it is not a confession. It is not an admission of guilt. I shouldn't have said what I said. I really shouldn't have said that about how you're always late. But if you'd be on time, I wouldn't get so angry about that. What kind of confession is that? That's a faux apology. I'm sorry I lost my temper, but if you would just listen when I'm trying to explain something to you, I wouldn't get so irritated. That's a faux apology. I know I said I would get that done, and I really should have, but I worked so late at the office yesterday I didn't get to it. I'm so sorry that I've had such a bad attitude, but if you would understand how stressful my life has been this last week, I think you would understand. Those are all faux apologies. Avoid if, but, and maybe at all costs. As soon as you say the word but, it takes away what you said before. As soon as you say, I'm tired, but I'm tired, if you would have, it cancels, it excuses every wrong thing you did. Maybe I should have tried harder. Maybe what I did was wrong. That's not an apology, that's a faux apology. Address everyone involved. Avoid if, but, and maybe. And number 3, admit specifically. Reject generalities. Identify specifically what you did wrong, your wrong actions, your wrong attitudes. Don't focus on how they feel about it. We'll get to their feelings. Their feelings are very important. But focus on what you did wrong. Admit it specifically. We gave the illustration about a husband and wife that were arguing one night and then the next morning. Don't just simply say, sorry about last night. Yeah, me too. And you kiss and off you go. That's not admitting specifically. All that does is avoid issues. It doesn't solve problems. It puts a Band-Aid on the wound. It doesn't solve it. It'd be much better to say, last night I was impatient with you, I was angry, I was sarcastic, and I didn't listen, and I responded sinfully. Admit very specifically what you did. Don't simply say, what I did bother you last night. Sorry about that. Admit specifically, what is it you did? What were your attitudes? What were your actions? What were your words that were so wrong and offensive? Identify it very specifically. Number 4, acknowledge the hurt. This is really important. And this is incredibly powerful in reconciling relationships. To acknowledge that what you did was hurtful to them. It's acknowledging that they know now that you know that what you did was harmful and hurtful to them and to the relationship. It basically is saying, I am viewing this from your perspective, and it has incredible power for healing relationships. Tell them how they must be feeling. You must be so frustrated. I know that really hurt when you admit specifically, when I did this, that had to be really hurtful to you. I told you before I wouldn't do that again, and here I just did it again. That has to be incredibly frustrating. You say that for them, it's incredibly powerful. Acknowledge how hurtful what you have done, how they must feel about it. Number 5, accept the consequences. If there are consequences, if there's restitution that needs to be made, make it. So you say to your boss, I know what I did. I deserve to lose my job. I would accept that. I get that. I don't have a right to keep this job. That's accepting the consequences. If you confess what you did was wrong and is a fireable offense, then you get offended that they fired you, then that's not accepting the consequence. That's a faux apology. Accept the consequences. Or if you damage someone's property, that you're going to make restitution. However you can fix it, you're going to fix it. You're going to accept the consequences. To illustrate, imagine this way. If I did all of these 4 but refused to accept the consequences. So I borrow your car, I'm driving your car, and then I show up at your house and say, hey, thanks for letting me borrow the car, and you look out and your car's not there, and I say, something kind of happened. I was on 390, and I'm addressing them. I'm not ignoring them. I'm addressing them. I'm not going to give any excuses. I'm going to say, yeah, I was texting while I was driving. I wasn't paying attention. And I went off the side of the road, and I hit the guardrail, and it bent the tire under, and it's not drivable. That has to be really frustrating. I wasn't driving responsibly. I'm really, really sorry. I've done those well, and then at this one I say, so here's your keys. It's on 390. I hope that'll get fixed. Yeah, that's not going to go over well, right? No, I need to accept the consequences. Here's what I'm doing to solve the problem. I could do all of those. If I don't accept the consequences, then it's not going to solve the problem. So accept whatever consequences there are. There's this character in the New Testament. If you grew up in church, maybe you grew up singing a song about this guy. His name's Zacchaeus, and he was in the town of Jericho. I was in Jericho a few weeks ago. Jericho was the town that Jesus would go through on his way up to Jerusalem. And Zacchaeus was, the Bible says he was vertically challenged. And he wasn't very tall, and Jesus came into town, and he wanted to see him. Zacchaeus was not a well-loved person in town. People didn't say, oh, Zacchaeus, you can't see, come on up front. No, they couldn't stand him. He was a tax collector. Tax collectors were among the most hated of the Jewish people because they were required to collect a certain amount for Rome, and then they were legally allowed to charge whatever they wanted. So tax collectors tended to be the richest people in town, because they could charge whatever they wanted, and they became wealthy off of the poor people of the town. So they were hated. Well, Zacchaeus heard about Jesus, and so he wanted to see him, so he climbed this tree to look at him, and Jesus comes by, stops at the tree, has a conversation, goes over to Zacchaeus' house, and it changed his life. And Zacchaeus, when he made things right, he accepted consequences. We read this in the book of Luke. It says this in Luke 19. Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. He's accepting the consequences of what happened and what he did. So how do we accept the consequences when we've sinned? Well, it might be, I told this situation and it wasn't true. I'm sorry. I'm going to go back to each of those people and make sure they know that what I said wasn't true. It was inaccurate information, and I shouldn't have shared it at all. It was wrong. That's accepting the consequences. I'm going to follow up with those people. Accepting the consequences is acknowledging that you're going to have a hard time trusting me because of what I did. I get that, and I long to earn your trust back. You're not confessing it and then having unrealistic expectations of those you've sinned against. Accept the consequences. All right, let's go to the next one, number 6. Alter your behavior. This is pretty simple. It's basically saying, with God's help, I don't want to do that. That's a habit I've been in. I don't want to do that. I'm going to change. By God's grace, I'm begging God to help me have the grace to change that. Or it's asking the question, what can I do differently next time? Again, it's not about behavior modification, it's about heart transformation, but it's saying, with God's help, I'm going to change that. Or I'm going to talk to the guys in my community group this week. I'm going to let them know what I did. I'm going to ask for their help. You're saying to your spouse, I was terribly impatient with you, and man, I do that all the time. I'm going to talk to the girls in my accountability group. I'm going to talk to the guys in my accountability group, the guys in my community group, and ask them to pray and hold me accountable and ask me how I'm doing. You're coming up with a plan because you want to change your behavior. And then finally is this. Ask for forgiveness. This is the hardest one of all. Ask for forgiveness. This is beyond just where you express regret. It's where you actually ask them to release you from the penalty of what you have done. Now, this is really important. I think there is a very big difference between saying the words, I'm sorry, and saying the words, will you forgive me? One of those is pretty easy to say. We'll say it all day long. We'll say I'm sorry when we bump into somebody in the hallway. We'll say I'm sorry when we accidentally spill coffee on the carpet. We'll say I'm sorry when we're in a fender bender. Somebody, oh, I'm so sorry. We'll say I'm sorry all day long. But you tell me, which is more difficult to say, I'm sorry or will you forgive me? Of course, will you forgive me is harder. Those are words we don't like to say. Let me tell you the difference between them and why I think it's important to literally ask for forgiveness. Here's the difference. Saying I'm sorry. I'm sorry is for unintentional, non-sinful choices. Unintentional, non-sinful choices. That's when you bump someone in the hallway, you get in a fender bender, you spill coffee on somebody's carpet. You say, I'm sorry. It wasn't on purpose. It was an accident. You stepped on someone's toe. I'm sorry. It expresses regret. It's saying that was unintentional. It wasn't sinful. It just was hurtful. I'm sorry I did that. I'm sorry can express minor regret, or it could be, I'm sorry I got caught. It could be anything. Will you forgive me, though, is different. Will you forgive me is for sinful choices, actions, or attitudes. Sinful choices, attitudes, and actions. If you sinned, it needs more than I'm sorry. It's asking for forgiveness. Saying I'm sorry is not enough. Saying I'm sorry isn't acknowledging sin. It might just be saying, I'm sorry I got caught, or it could be, I'm sorry you're so sensitive. But when you ask, will you forgive me, it is an incredibly powerful tool for reconciliation. So, I urge you to consider this week, when you sin against someone, refuse to say, I'm sorry. Choose to say, will you forgive me? It's asking them to release you from the offense of what you've done. Now, let me give you a couple examples of this. You tell me which is better. If someone confronts you and says, hey, by the way, I heard you were gossiping about me with those 3 guys at work, I want to know if that's true, and it's true. Imagine if you just simply say, you're right, yeah, I shouldn't have done that, you're right, things are tough, pressure is high, and I got a little bit upset about what happened, and so I told them the story, and I shouldn't have done that, sorry about that. How's that go over with you? My guess is that actually goes over okay with you. You're used to it, we're all used to it. That's how people apologize. We say, okay, well, don't worry about it. But what if instead of simply saying I'm sorry, what if they walked through the 7 A's of confession? What if they addressed you specifically and told you they're going to address the 3 guys that they told the story to? And they said no ifs, buts, and maybes. They didn't say, well, it was late, I was tired, if maybe you would have, maybe perhaps I shouldn't have done that. They get very specific. Yeah, I told them this story. There's no reason I told it to them. It made you look bad. It made me look good. That has to be extremely frustrating. That has to be incredibly painful. I would hate it if someone did it to me. You must be really frustrated. I accept the consequences. I'm going to go back to all 3 of those guys and apologize and ask for their forgiveness. You didn't deserve that. That was wrong. It was sinful of me. Alter your behavior. I want to try to not do that. Thank you for talking to me. I'm going to talk to my wife and ask her to help me not to do that. She knows that I struggle with this. And what I want to ask you is, will you please forgive me for that? I'm telling you, you'd feel totally different about that. If someone gossips about you and they come to you and say, sorry about that, your relationship is, it's a little better, but it's not better than it was before the gossip. If someone gossips about you and walks through the 7 A's of confession, I would suggest your relationship is probably stronger than it was before they sinned against you. It has a powerful impact. I have often said I probably have to confess sin more than anybody I know. Because I'm a great sinner. And if at home, my wife, I get frustrated with her, I'm not a yeller, I'm not a screamer, but I'll show annoyances, or I'll get sarcastic. So let's say one night that I'm just, because of my own sinful choices and not reacting well to difficulties around me, I become very impatient with my wife, and it shows. And you could just feel the tension in the room. And I'm short with her, and I'm angry, and I'm sarcastic, and I'm really quiet, and she senses it, and so she gets quiet, and then my daughters feel like, what's going on around here? The easiest thing to do and the most culturally acceptable thing to do is just to say, hey, Sue, last night, sorry about that. I just had a bad attitude. Sorry, I shouldn't have, I was pretty tired, a pretty stressful day at work. Sorry about that. And my wife is gracious just like you are, and she'd say, yeah, don't worry about it, thanks. She'd give me a kiss and off I go. But imagine the power of following these 7 A's of confession and addressing Sue and addressing my daughters and not using if, but, and maybe and making excuses. I was tired. If you would have, why didn't you? If you could understand what I'm going through, refusing to say any of that, admitting specifically, I was sarcastic, I was short with you, I didn't listen to you, I was annoyed with you, I was unkind to you. Acknowledge the hurt. I know that's frustrating. I hate when I do that. You must get so frustrated with me. That had to be incredibly hurtful. Accept the consequences. Sue, I'm talking to you. I'm going to talk to the girls. I'm going to mention it to the guys at the office today to help me, hold me accountable. I don't want to do that anymore. By God's grace, I want to grow in this. Sue, will you please forgive me? My relationship with her is stronger after that than it was before. If I simply say, I shouldn't have done that, I was real tired, sorry, I wish I could do that over, shouldn't have done that, sorry about that. She'd say yes. But I don't think that's biblical forgiveness. So, what about you? Can you recognize the incredible power of seeking forgiveness? Can you recognize the shock people have if you follow the 7 A's of confession? It's incredibly powerful. And it grants amazing freedom. You see, here's the deal. If you've sinned against someone, and so you confess it to them and you follow the 7 A's of confession, then God says your responsibility is done. If they choose to forgive you or not is up to them. Then God holds them responsible. Before you seek their forgiveness, God holds you responsible. Once you've sought their forgiveness, God holds them responsible. There's incredible freedom in confessing our sin to each other. So let me remind you, Proverbs 28:13. Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. See, the reality is when we confess our sin, it doesn't just reconcile relationships. God uses our humble confessions to change us. So this week, will you consider rejecting the faux apologies of our culture and reject simply saying, I'm sorry? And only use the phrase, I'm sorry, for unintentional, non-sinful situations. And instead, would you follow the 7 A's of confession? Be very open and very honest and very humble and ask for forgiveness. And watch what God does in your own heart and in the relationship in which you've been in conflict. Let's pray together. God, this is hard. It's especially hard because even as we hear it, we know it's true, but we long for other people to make corrections and changes. I pray that you would help us to examine only ourselves and to look in the mirror of our relational conflicts rather than through the window of our conflicts, and be willing to submit to what you want us to do for your glory and our great good. Father, help us to live lives wholly pleasing to you, because it will be for your glory and our joy. Amen. Let me just encourage you on a couple of things. Those for whom this is the biggest challenge are those in this room that don't even know it's your biggest challenge. And let me just fill you in on who you may be. This sermon is going to be really, really hard for you if the whole time you're thinking this thought. Yeah, I need to do better at that, but he needs to. Yeah, I need to do better at that, but I sure hope she was listening. And we kind of laugh at that, but you had the thought a couple times, didn't you? That's just our natural tendency to think, oh yeah, I want to do this too, but. So here's what I hope. I pray by God's grace you recognize that seeking confession for sins that we've committed is one of the most humbling, faith-building, character-growing experiences in life. And may today be more than just a challenge that you walk out and think, man, that's good. I sure could do that better. And may it turn into something you proactively seek to do this week. Because you will sin against someone this week. The question is, will you use God's tools for reconciliation for that relationship and his tool for character building in your life and seek forgiveness? The one who confesses a sin and renounces it finds mercy. So with God, there is always great mercy with confession. And may you find, as you humble yourself, may you find mercy, even among that one that you struggle with conflict. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. God bless you. See you next week.